on Jesus' words at the end of Matthew's gospel, where he told the disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, and that he would be with them till the end of the age, the 5th century church father Jerome wrote this, quote, Jesus was present in all places, with Thomas in India, with Peter in Rome, with Paul in Illyria, with Titus in Crete, with Andrew in Greece, and with each apostle in his own separate region, unquote. Now, so far, we've followed the track of most Western reviews of church history, both secular and religious, by concentrating on what took place in the West and the Roman Empire. We've delved somewhat into the Eastern Roman Empire, which continued to think of itself as the Roman Empire long after the West had disintegrated in just the 5th century. It was only later that it was referred to as the Byzantine Empire. Now, in recent episodes, we've seen the focus of attention shift to the East with the Christological controversies of the 4th and 5th centuries. In this episode, we'll stay in the East and follow the track of the expansion of the faith as it moved eastward. This is an amazing chapter that often gets overlooked in traditional treatments of church history. It's well captured by Philip Jenkins in his book, The Lost History of Christianity. We'll start all the way back at the beginning with the Apostle Thomas. Now, he's linked by fairly solid tradition to the spread of Christianity into the East. In the quote that we started with from the early 5th century church father Jerome, we learn that the Apostle Thomas carried the gospel east all the way to India. In the 4th century, Eusebius also attributed the expansion of the faith in India to Thomas. Though these traditions do face some dispute, there are still so-called Thomas Christians in the southern Indian state of Kerala to this day. They use an Aramaic form of worship that had to have been transported there very early. A tomb and a shrine in honor of Thomas at Mylapore is built with bricks that had been used in a Roman trading colony, but that was abandoned about AD 50. They were repurposed in the building of these structures. Now, there's abundant evidence of several Roman trading colonies along the coast of India, with hundreds of 1st century coins and ample evidence of Jewish communities. Jews were known to be a major part of Roman trade ventures. Their communities were prime stopping places for the efforts of Christian missionaries as they followed the Apostle Paul's models we see described in the book of Acts. A song commemorating Thomas's role in bringing the faith to India wasn't committed to writing until 1601, but it was said to have been passed on in the state of Kerala for 50 generations. Many trading vessels sailed to India in the 1st century when the secret of the monsoon winds was finally discovered. And so it's quite possible that Thomas did indeed make the journey. Once the monsoons were finally figured out, over 100 trade ships a year crossed from the Red Sea to India. Jesus told the disciples to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. While they were slow to catch on to the need to leave Jerusalem, persecution eventually convinced them it was time to get moving. It's not hard imagining Thomas considering a voyage to India as a way to literally fulfill the command of Christ. India would have seen the end of the earth. Thomas's work in India began in the northwest region of the country. A 4th century work called The Acts of Thomas says that he led a ruler there named Gundafor to the faith. That story was rejected by most scholars until an inscription was discovered in 1890 along with some coins which verify the 20-year reign in the 1st century of a king, Gundafor. Now, after planting the church in the north, Thomas traveled by ship to the Malabar coast in the south. He planted several churches, mainly along the Peyo River. He preached to all classes of people and had about 17,000 converts from all Indian castes. Stone crosses were erected at places where churches were founded, which became centers of later pilgrimage. Thomas was careful to appoint local leadership for the churches that he founded. He then traveled overland to the southeast Indian coast, the area around Madras. Another local king and many of his subjects were converted. But the Brahmins, the highest of the Indian castes, were concerned that the gospel would undermine a cultural system that was to their advantage, and so they convinced the king at Mylapore to arrest and interrogate Thomas. He was sentenced to death and executed in AD 72. The church in that area then came under persecution, and many Christians fled for refuge to Kerala. 100 years later, according to both Eusebius and Jerome, A theologian from the great school at Alexandria named Pantaenus traveled to India to preach Christ to the Brahmins. Serving to confirm Thomas's work in India is the writing of Bardaisan. At the opening of the 3rd century, he spoke of entire tribes following Jesus in North India who claimed to have been converted by the Apostle Thomas. They had numerous books and relics to prove it. By AD 226, there were bishops of the church in the east in northwest India, Afghanistan, and Baluchistan, with thousands of laymen and clergy engaging in missionary activity. Such a well-established Christian community means the presence of the faith there for the previous several decades at the least. The church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, to whom we owe so much of our information about the early church, attributed to Thomas the spread of the gospel to the east. As those familiar with the history of the Roman Empire know, the Romans faced continuous grief in the east by one Persian group after another. Their contest with the Parthians and then later the Sassanids is a thing of legend. The buffer zone between the Romans and the Persians was called Osrhoene, with its capital city at Edessa, located at the border of what today is northern Syria and eastern Turkey. Now, according to Eusebius, Thomas received a request from Agbar, king of Edessa, for healing, and responded by sending Thaddeus, one of the disciples mentioned in Luke chapter 10. The gospel took root there. There was a sizable Jewish community in Edessa from which the gospel made several converts. Word got back to Israel of the church community growing in the city, and when persecution broke out in the Roman Empire, many refugees made their way east to settle in places that were now welcoming them. Edessa became a center of the Syrian-speaking church, which began sending missionaries even further east into Mesopotamia, north into Persia, Central Asia, and then even further eastward. The missionary Mari managed to plant a church in the glorious Persian capital of Ctesiphon, located just north of the ancient site of Babylon, which became a center of missionary outreach in its own right. By the late 2nd century, Christianity had spread throughout Media, Persia, Parthia, and Bactria. The 24 bishops who oversaw the region carried out their ministry more as itinerant missionaries than by just staying in a single church and city. They were what we would refer to as tent makers, earning their way as merchants and craftsmen as they shared the faith wherever they went. By AD 280, the churches of Mesopotamia and Persia adopted the title Catholic to acknowledge their unity with the Western Church during the last days of persecution by the Roman emperors. Now, I want to insert a quick housekeeping note here. I just gave the date AD 280, which will sound to many as 80 280, two numbers instead of letters and then numbers. It sounds to my ear that way and has for several of the dates we've given so far. Since we all know that we're dealing with the years after Christ, I'm just going to drop the AD from now on and just give the year. In 424, the Mesopotamian church held a council at the city of Ctesiphon, where they elected their first lead bishop to have jurisdiction over the whole church of the East, including India and Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka. Now, Ctesiphon was an important point on the east-west trade routes, which extended to India, China, Java, and Japan. The shift of ecclesiastical authority was now away from Edessa, which in 216 became a tributary of Rome. The establishment of an independent patriarchate contributed to a more favorable attitude by the Persians, who no longer had to fear an alliance with the hated Romans. To the northwest of Persia was the ancient kingdom of Armenia, which had been a political football between the Persians and the Romans for generations. Both the Persians and the Romans used Armenia as a place to try out new diplomatic maneuvers against or with each other. The poor Armenians just wanted to be left alone, but that was not to be, given their location between these two mighty empires. Armenia has the historical distinction of being the first state to embrace Christianity as a national religion, even before the conversion of Constantine the Great in the early 4th century. The one who brought the gospel to Armenia was a member of the royal family named Gregory, called the Illuminator. While still a boy, Gregory's family was exiled from Armenia to Cappadocia when his father was thought to have been part of a plot against the king. As a grown man who'd become a Christian, Gregory returned home where he shared the faith with King Tiridates, who ruled at the dawn of the 4th century. Tiridates was converted, and Gregory's son succeeded him as bishop of the new Armenian church. Now, this son attended the Council of Nicaea in 325. Armenian Christianity has remained a distinctive and important brand of the faith, with 5 million still professing allegiance to the Armenian church. Though persecution came to an official end in the Roman Empire with Constantine's Edict of Toleration in 313, it began for the church in Persia in 340. Now, the primary cause for persecution there was political. When Rome became Christian, its old enemy turned anti-Christian. Now, up to that point, the situation had been reversed. For the first 300 years, it was in the West that Christians were persecuted, and Persia was a refuge. The Parthians were religiously tolerant, while their less tolerant Sassanid successors were too busy fighting Rome to waste time or effort on the Christians among them. But in 315, a letter from the Emperor Constantine to his Persian counterpart, Shapur II, triggered the beginnings of an ominous change in the Persian attitude toward Christians. Constantine believed he was writing to help his fellow believers in Persia, but he succeeded only in exposing them. He wrote to the young Persian ruler, quote, "I rejoice to hear that the fairest provinces of Persia are adorned with Christians. Since you are so powerful and pious, I commend them to your care and leave them in your protection," unquote. Now, the schemes and the intrigues that had flowed for generations between Rome and the Parthians, and then their successors, the Sassanids, were so intense, the letter moved Shapur to become suspicious that the Christians were a kind of fifth column, working from inside the Persian Empire to bring the Sassanids down. Any doubts were dispelled 20 years later when Constantine gathered his forces in the east for war. Eusebius says that Roman bishops accompanied the army into battle. To make matters worse, in Persia, one of their own preachers predicted that Rome would defeat the Sassanids. Little wonder then, when persecution began shortly after, the first accusation brought against Christians was that they were aiding the enemy. Shapur ordered a double taxation on Christians and held their bishop responsible for collecting it. Shapur knew that Christians tended to be poor, since so many of them had come from the West fleeing persecution, and so the bishop would be hard-pressed to come up with the money. But Bishop Simon refused to be intimidated. He declared the tax unjust and said, "I'm no tax collector. I'm a shepherd of the Lord's flock." Shapur counter-declared that the church was now in rebellion, and the killing began. A second decree ordered the destruction of churches and the execution of clergy who refused to participate in the official Sassanid-sponsored sun worship. Bishop Simon was seized, brought before Shapur. Offered a huge bribe to capitulate, he refused. The Sassanids promised that if he alone would renounce Christ, the rest of the Christian community wouldn't be harmed, but that if he refused, he would be condemning all Christians to destruction. When the Christians heard of this, they rose up protesting en masse that this was shameful. And so Bishop Simon and a large number of the clergy were executed. For the next 20 years, Christians were hounded from one end of Persia to the other. At times it was a general massacre, but most often it was targeted at church leaders. Another form of suppression was the search for that part of the Christian community that was most vulnerable to persecution: Persians who'd converted from the native Zoroastrianism. The faith spread first among non-Persians in the population, especially Jews and Syrians. But by the beginning of the 4th century, Persians in increasing numbers were attracted to the Christian faith. For such converts, church membership often meant the loss of everything: their family, property rights, even their lives. The martyrdom of Bishop Simon and the years of persecution that followed gutted the Persian church of its leadership and organization. As soon as the Christians of Ctesiphon elected a new bishop, he would be seized and killed. Adding to the anti-Roman motivation of the government's role in the persecution was a deep undercurrent of Zoroastrian fanaticism that came as a result of the conversion of so many of their number to Christianity. It was a shocking example of religious envy. Now, shortly before Shapur II's death in 379, persecution slackened. It had lasted for 40 years and only ended with his death. When at last the suffering ceased, it was estimated that close to 200,000 Persian Christians had been put to death.